My son disappeared 30 years ago, when he was 25 years old. The police searched for months. Our family never stopped looking, and missing person posters with his face are still in some old filing cabinet somewhere. Friends and neighbors helped us search the woods, drag the rivers, check every lead. But I know exactly where he is. I know because I'm the one who killed him one night in our garage and buried his body in the forest behind our house. For 3 decades, I've helped my wife search for a son I know we'll never find. Every time she cries, every time she lights a candle on his birthday, I comfort her while knowing the truth. I'm the one who made sure he disappeared forever. This confession reveals the darkest side of fatherhood and family secrets. If you're ready to hear what really happened to my son 30 years ago, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the bell and never miss another haunting confession from the elderly, who can no longer carry their secrets to the grave. Before we begin, drop your age in the comments below. I want to know how old you are when you first hear a truth this devastating. Now, let me tell you everything. My name is Robert Mitchell, and I am 73 years old. For 30 years, I have lived with a secret so terrible that it has slowly destroyed me from the inside. My son Daniel Mitchell has been officially missing since March 15, 1995. He was 25 years old, bright, ambitious, with his whole life ahead of him. The police investigated, the community searched, and our family has never stopped hoping he might somehow, someday come home. But he never will, because I killed him. Not in self-defense, not accidentally, not in any way that could be justified or forgiven. I murdered my own son in a moment of rage, buried his body in the woods behind our property, and then spent the next 3 decades pretending to search for him while knowing exactly where he was. I have comforted my wife through 30 years of grief, watched my daughter grow up with the ghost of her missing brother haunting her, and maintained the facade of a devastated father waiting for answers. The truth is, I am the answer. I am the reason Daniel never came home. I am the monster who destroyed my own family. It started long before that night in March 1995. The problems between Daniel and me had been building for years, maybe his entire life. I was a difficult father, controlling and demanding, with specific ideas about what a man should be and how a son should behave. Daniel was sensitive, artistic, interested in things I considered frivolous. He wanted to be a writer. I wanted him to take over my construction business. We fought constantly throughout his teenage years, about his grades, his friends, his choices, his future. I thought I was pushing him to be better, to be stronger, to prepare for the harsh realities of life. But I was really just pushing him away, damaging our relationship with every criticism and every impossible expectation. Daniel moved out when he was 19, got an apartment across town with some friends. The distance helped slightly. We could be civil at family dinners, could have superficial conversations that avoided the deeper conflicts, but the tension was always there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the next eruption. He graduated from college with a degree in English literature, something I had argued against constantly. Useless degree, I told him. No job prospects, no future, no practical application. But he did it anyway. One of the few times he openly defied me. I didn't attend his graduation. I told myself I was too busy with work, but the truth was, I was sulking, angry that he had chosen his own path instead of mine. After graduation, Daniel struggled to find work. He waited tables, worked in bookstores, took odd jobs while trying to write his novel. I saw this as vindication of my warnings, proof that I had been right about his impractical dreams. I couldn't resist mentioning it every time we spoke, couldn't stop myself from saying he should have listened to me, should have made smarter choices. My wife Karen tried to mediate between us. She loved Daniel unconditionally, supported his dreams even when they seemed unrealistic. She would defend him when I criticized, would smooth over our arguments, would beg us both to try to understand each other. She was the glue holding our fractured family together, though I didn't appreciate it at the time. Our daughter Emily was 12 years older than Daniel. She had already moved to another state by the time the worst of our conflicts began. She called regularly, tried to stay connected to her little brother, but she wasn't there to witness the daily deterioration of our relationship. She remembered a happier family, a time before everything fell apart. In early 1995, Daniel got some good news. A small literary journal had accepted one of his short stories for publication. It wasn't much, no money, just recognition, but for him it was everything. Validation that his writing mattered, that his dreams weren't completely foolish. He was so excited when he came to tell us, practically glowing with pride and joy. Karen was thrilled for him, hugged him, asked to read the story. But I couldn't bring myself to be happy for him. All I could see was my 25-year-old son, still living in a cramped apartment, still working minimum wage jobs, now wasting his time on unpaid publication in some journal no one would ever read. I made some dismissive comment about when he was going to get a real job, when he was going to start taking life seriously. The light went out of his eyes. He left shortly after, and Karen was furious with me. She said I was impossible, that I couldn't just be happy for our son for one moment, that I was pushing him away permanently. We fought that night, one of our worst arguments in years. She said if I kept this up, I would lose Daniel forever. I told her she was being dramatic, that Daniel needed tough love, not endless coddling. I didn't know how right she was. Within weeks, I would lose Daniel forever. But not the way she meant. March 15th, 1995, started as an ordinary day. I was working on a construction project, came home tired and irritable around 7 in the evening. Karen mentioned that Daniel had called and was coming over around 8 to talk to me about something important. She seemed worried, said Daniel had sounded serious on the phone. I assumed he needed money again, or wanted to announce some other impractical plan I would have to talk him out of. I was already annoyed before he even arrived, already preparing my arguments and criticisms. Daniel showed up at 8:15. He looked nervous, kept fidgeting with his car keys. Karen offered him dinner, but he declined, said he just needed to talk to his father. We went out to the garage, my workshop, where I often retreated when I needed space. Karen stayed in the house, giving us privacy she probably hoped would lead to reconciliation, rather than another fight. Daniel told me he had been offered a teaching position at a small college in Oregon, English literature, starting in the fall. It wasn't a tenure-track position, the pay was modest, but it was a real job doing what he loved. He would be moving across the country in a few months. No further. He said it carefully, watching my reaction, probably expecting the criticism he usually received. But this time was different. This time, hearing that he was leaving, that he was moving 3,000 miles away, something inside me snapped. I started yelling, accusing him of running away, of taking a meaningless job just to spite me, of abandoning the family. None of it was rational, none of it was fair, but I couldn't stop myself. Years of resentment and disappointment and anger came pouring out in a torrent of cruel words. Daniel tried to defend himself, tried to explain that this was an opportunity, that he needed to build his own life. But I wasn't listening. I was too consumed by rage, by the feeling that I was losing control, that my son was escaping my influence permanently. The argument escalated. We were both shouting now, saying terrible things, crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. Daniel said he had spent his entire life trying to earn my approval, and had finally realized he never would. He said I was impossible to please, that nothing he did would ever be good enough. He said he was done trying, done caring what I thought, And then he said the words that sealed his fate. He said he wished I wasn't his father, that his life would have been better without me in it, that he couldn't wait to move across the country and never have to see my disapproving face again. Something broke inside me, not just anger now, but something darker, something primal and uncontrollable. I grabbed a hammer from my workbench. I don't even remember making the decision to pick it up, and I swung it. The first blow caught Daniel on the side of his head. He went down immediately, shock and pain on his face. He tried to speak, but no words came out, and I didn't stop. I hit him again and again and again. All the years of frustration and anger and disappointment poured into those blows. By the time rationality returned, by the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late. Daniel was dead. My son was dead, and I had killed him. I stood there in my garage, covered in blood, looking down at my son's body, and the full horror of what I had done crashed over me. This wasn't supposed to happen. We were just arguing, just another fight in a long history of fights. But I had taken it too far, lost control completely, and now my son was dead. I should have called the police immediately, should have confessed, faced the consequences, accepted responsibility for what I had done, but panic overtook me. All I could think was, Karen can't see this. Emily can't know I did this. I'll lose everything. I'll go to prison. My life will be over. So instead of doing the right thing, I made a choice that would haunt me for the next 30 years. I decided to hide what I had done. The garage had a side door that opened directly to the backyard. I checked to make sure Karen wasn't nearby, then dragged Daniel's body outside. It was dark, after 9 o'clock now, and our property backed up to dense woods. I had tools, I had a truck, and I had desperate motivation. I wrapped Daniel's body in a tarp from my workshop, loaded it into my truck, and drove deep into the woods on the old logging road that ran through our property. About 2 miles in, far from any trail or road, I found a spot. I dug for hours in the cold March ground, digging until my hands bled and my back screamed in agony. I buried my son in that forest, covered him with dirt and leaves and debris, tried to make it look like undisturbed ground. Then I drove back home, cleaned the garage meticulously, burning the bloody rags in our fireplace, scrubbing every surface until no trace of what had happened remained. It was after 2 in the morning when I finally went inside. Karen was still awake, worried. She asked what had happened, where Daniel was. I told her the lie I had prepared during those hours in the woods. Daniel and I had argued. He had stormed off in his car, said he needed space, and would call tomorrow. Karen was upset, but not suspicious. Arguments between Daniel and me were common enough that this seemed plausible. She went to bed, still hoping we would work things out, that tomorrow Daniel would call and we could all move forward. But tomorrow came, and Daniel didn't call. The next day passed, and the day after that. Karen started to worry. I suggested that maybe Daniel was still angry, needed time to cool off. I kept her calm for almost a week before she insisted we do something. On March 22nd, 7 days after I killed my son, I called the police to report him missing. I told them about our argument, about Daniel leaving angry. I acted concerned, worried, playing the role of the anxious father. The police took a report, asked routine questions, and began their investigation. They found Daniel's car parked near his apartment. His roommate said he hadn't been home since the night he came to see me. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. His bank account showed no activity. His phone calls stopped. Daniel Mitchell had simply vanished. The police interviewed me multiple times. Each time, I told the same story. We argued. He left. I assumed he needed space. I never mentioned the hammer, the blood, the body buried in the woods behind my house. I showed appropriate concern, cooperated fully, even helped organize search parties. Friends and neighbors searched the woods where Daniel was buried. They walked right past his grave, calling his name, looking for any sign of him, and I searched with them, pretending to hope we would find him alive, knowing the entire time that he was beneath our feet. Karen was devastated. She made missing person posters, contacted media outlets, created a tip line. She became obsessed with finding Daniel, with bringing our son home, and I supported her in all of it, helped her with the posters and the phone calls and the endless searching, all while knowing it was pointless, all while carrying the crushing weight of what I had done. The investigation eventually went cold, with no leads, no evidence, no trace of where Daniel had gone. The police had nothing to work with. He became just another missing person, one of thousands who disappear every year, without explanation. The case file stayed open, but inactive, gathering dust, while life moved on. Except life didn't really move on. Not for Karen, who never stopped believing Daniel would come home. Not for Emily, who flew back multiple times to help search, who struggled with the trauma of her brother's disappearance. Not for the community that remembered Daniel and wondered what happened to him, and not for me, because I knew the truth. I knew Daniel wasn't coming home, knew he wasn't living somewhere else under a new identity, knew he wasn't the victim of some random crime. I knew he was in the forest, in the grave I had dug for him, and that he would stay there until someone discovered him, or until I confessed. For 30 years, I have lived with that knowledge. 30 years of watching Karen grieve, of pretending to search, of maintaining the lie. 30 years of being called a devoted father who never gave up hope, when the truth was I was a murderer, hiding in plain sight. The guilt has been unbearable. Every birthday, every holiday, every anniversary of his disappearance, the weight grows heavier. I see Daniel's face in my dreams, see him as he was in those final moments, confused and hurt, and dying. I wake up in cold sweats, his name on my lips, Karen beside me, asking if I'm all right. I'm not all right. I haven't been all right for 30 years, and I never will be again. The first year after Daniel's disappearance was the most difficult, though not for the reasons anyone might expect. It wasn't the grief that tormented me, though I carried that too, genuine sorrow for the son I had killed in a moment of uncontrolled rage. It was the performance, the constant exhausting performance of being a devastated father searching for his missing son. Every day required acting concerned when talking to police, acting hopeful when comforting Karen, acting devastated when another lead turned into nothing. I had to calibrate my emotions perfectly, sad enough to be believable, but not so broken that I couldn't function, hopeful enough to keep searching, but not so optimistic that I seemed detached from reality. Karen threw herself into the search with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She made it her life's purpose to find Daniel, to bring him home. She contacted psychics, hired private investigators with money we couldn't afford, drove to other states following tips that always led nowhere. And I went with her, supported her, pretended to share her hope while knowing every mile we drove, every person we interviewed, every lead we chased was pointless. Emily came home frequently that first year, taking time off from her job and leaving her own family to help search for her brother. She was 37 years old, with 2 young children of her own, but she dropped everything repeatedly to be there. The guilt of watching her sacrifice for a brother I knew was dead, buried in the woods she had searched a dozen times, was almost unbearable, but I bore it, because the alternative, confession, prison, the destruction of everything, was unthinkable. So I continued the lie, day after day, week after week, month after month. the community was remarkably supportive. Our neighbors organized search parties, raised money for reward funds, kept Daniel's case in the local news. They treated me with sympathy and respect, called me brave for not giving up hope. I accepted their kindness, while knowing I was a fraud, a murderer, masquerading as a grieving father. On Daniel's 26th birthday, 4 months after I killed him, Karen organized a candlelight vigil. Nearly 200 people gathered in the town square, holding candles and photos of Daniel, praying for his safe return. I stood beside Karen, my arm around her shoulders as she wept, and I spoke to the crowd about not giving up hope, about believing Daniel would come home. The applause and support felt like knives cutting into me. These people believed in me, trusted my grief, shared our family's pain. And all of it was based on a lie so enormous that it poisoned everything it touched. I started having nightmares around 6 months after Daniel's death. In them I would be leading a search party through the woods, and someone would find the grave. The dreams were vivid, terrifying, police digging up Daniel's remains, forensic experts examining the evidence, everyone turning to look at me with sudden understanding and accusation in their eyes. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, convinced it had really happened. It took minutes of staring at the dark ceiling, listening to Karen's steady breathing beside me, to remember that it was just a dream. The secret was still safe. Daniel was still buried. No one knew what I had done. But the nightmares continued, varying in details but always ending the same way: discovery, accusation, the end of everything. They became so frequent and intense that I started avoiding sleep, staying awake as long as possible to delay the inevitable dreams. Karen worried about my insomnia, suggested I see a doctor, but I refused. How could I explain that I couldn't sleep because I was haunted by the son I had murdered? Work became impossible to focus on. My construction business suffered from my distraction and exhaustion. I made mistakes, missed deadlines, lost clients. My employees were sympathetic, of course. The boss was struggling. His son was missing, but sympathy didn't pay the bills. Within 2 years, the business that I had spent decades building, the business I had wanted Daniel to inherit, was failing. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had killed my son partly because of his rejection of this business, and now the business was dying anyway, killed by the guilt and distraction of what I had done to him. Everything I thought I was protecting, everything I thought justified my controlling behavior and impossible expectations, was falling apart. Karen noticed my decline. She suggested counseling, therapy, support groups for families of missing persons. I went to a few sessions, sat in circles with other people whose loved ones had vanished, listened to their pain and their hope, but I couldn't connect with them. Their grief was real. Their situations were genuine mysteries. Mine was a performance, a cover-up, a daily betrayal of everyone who believed my lies. The therapist asked how I was coping with the uncertainty, with not knowing what happened to Daniel. I said it was the worst part, the not knowing, the endless questions. I said I replayed our last conversation constantly, wondering if I could have done something different, said something different. This part was true, at least. I did replay our last conversation constantly, but I knew exactly what I could have done differently. Not picked up that hammer, not lost control, not killed my son. Year 2 brought new challenges. The initial intensity of the search faded as leads dried up, and hope became harder to maintain. The community's attention moved on to other tragedies, other concerns. The newspaper articles stopped. The search parties became smaller and less frequent. Daniel was becoming just another cold case, another name on a long list of unsolved disappearances. Karen took this decline in attention as a personal failure. She redoubled her efforts, became more desperate, more willing to chase unlikely leads and believe impossible theories. She insisted Daniel was alive somewhere, that he had amnesia or was being held against his will. She couldn't accept that he might be dead, because accepting that meant giving up hope, and hope was all she had left. I encouraged her denial, because it served my purposes. As long as she believed Daniel was alive somewhere, she wouldn't push for memorial services or death certificates, or any official acknowledgement that he was gone. As long as we were searching for a living person, no one would look too closely at the possibility that he had been murdered, and certainly no one would suspect that the devoted father leading the search was actually the killer. Emily eventually had to step back from the intensive searching. Her children needed their mother, her marriage needed attention, her job couldn't accommodate more extended absences. She felt tremendous guilt about this, felt she was abandoning her brother. She called constantly, asked for updates, contributed money to private investigators, but she couldn't be physically present anymore. Karen resented Emily's withdrawal, though she tried to hide it. She felt abandoned, felt like she was the only one still fighting for Daniel. She didn't understand that Emily had her own life, her own family, her own responsibilities, and I couldn't defend Emily without sounding like I was giving up on Daniel. So I stayed silent and watched the distance grow between my wife and my daughter. 5 years after Daniel's disappearance, something changed in Karen. The obsessive searching began to fade, replaced by a different kind of grief. She stopped chasing every lead, stopped driving to other states on tips from strangers. She transformed Daniel's old bedroom into a shrine, keeping everything exactly as he had left it. But she stopped acting like he might walk through the door at any moment. She said she had accepted that we might never know what happened to him, that she was trying to find peace with the uncertainty. But I could see she hadn't really accepted anything. She had just shifted from active searching to passive waiting, still holding on to hope, but no longer exhausting herself chasing it. This should have made things easier for me. Less active searching meant less risk of discovery, but instead I found it harder. Karen's transition into acceptance forced me to acknowledge that we were entering a new phase: permanent grief, ongoing loss, a lifetime of living with Daniel's absence, and I was responsible for all of it. Around year 7, I started having health problems: high blood pressure, heart palpitations, stress-related issues that my doctor attributed to the ongoing trauma of Daniel's disappearance. The doctor encouraged therapy, stress management, possibly medication. He said unresolved grief could manifest physically, that I needed to take care of myself. But the health problems weren't from grief. They were from guilt. From 7 years of lying, 7 years of maintaining an elaborate deception, 7 years of carrying the knowledge that I had killed my son and buried him in the woods. The stress wasn't from not knowing what happened to Daniel. It was from knowing exactly what happened and having to hide it from everyone. I thought about confessing constantly during this period. The burden had grown so heavy that sometimes confession seemed like the only way to relieve it. I imagined walking into the police station, telling them where to find Daniel's body, finally admitting what I had done. I imagined the relief of not having to lie anymore, of not having to pretend, but I also imagined Karen's face when she learned the truth, imagined Emily's horror, imagined the trial, the conviction, the prison sentence, imagined spending whatever years I had left behind bars, hated by everyone who had once sympathized with me, and I couldn't do it. Couldn't take that step, couldn't face those consequences. So I stayed silent and let the stress continue destroying me from the inside. Year 10 brought an anniversary event organized by a local missing persons advocacy group. They wanted to highlight Daniel's case, to remind the community that he was still missing, still needed to be found. Karen was grateful, saw it as validation that Daniel hadn't been forgotten. She asked me to speak at the event, to address the community as Daniel's father. I stood in front of 100 people and talked about my son, about his love of reading, his talent for writing, his dreams of being published. I talked about the pain of not knowing where he was, of living with endless questions. I said we would never stop hoping, never stop searching, never give up on bringing Daniel home. and everyone listened with sympathy and respect, moved by the devoted father who had spent a decade searching for his son. It was the purest form of torture. Every word I spoke was true. I did love Daniel. I did remember his dreams, but it was also all a lie. I wasn't searching for him. I knew where he was, and the pain I described, while real, wasn't from not knowing. It was from knowing and having to hide it. After the event, people came up to thank me for my strength, my perseverance, my refusal to give up. They called me an inspiration. They said Daniel was lucky to have a father who loved him so much, and I accepted their praise while wanting to scream the truth at them. I'm not devoted. I'm a murderer. I'm not strong. I'm a coward. Daniel isn't lucky. He's dead, killed by the father everyone thinks is searching for him. The years continued to pass. 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. The acute pain of the first years gave way to a dull, constant ache. Daniel's disappearance became part of our family's identity, the tragedy that defined us. People knew us as the Mitchells, the family whose son had disappeared. It was how we were introduced, how we were remembered. Karen aged rapidly under the weight of ongoing grief. She was only 68, but she looked a decade older. The years of searching, of hoping, of never having closure, had worn her down physically and emotionally. She still kept Daniel's room as a shrine, still marked his birthday with candles, still checked missing person databases, hoping for a match. But the intensity had dulled. She was going through motions more than pursuing active hope. Emily had mostly moved on with her life, though Daniel's absence still affected her. Her children were teenagers now, growing up knowing about the uncle who had disappeared before they were born. Emily visited a few times a year, still asked about any updates, but she had built a life that existed separately from the tragedy. She had to for her own survival, and I continued to carry the secret. 30 years of living a lie, 30 years of watching Karen grieve for a son I had killed, 30 years of being called a devoted father while knowing I was actually a murderer. The guilt never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with time, compounding with each passing year, each birthday, each anniversary. I avoided the forest where Daniel was buried, couldn't bear to go near it, couldn't stand the thought of being close to his remains. But sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I would drive to the edge of that forest and just sit there, staring into the darkness where my son lay. I would apologize to him in my mind, tell him I was sorry for what I did, for the life he didn't get to live, sorry for the career he never built, the family he never had, the years stolen from him, sorry that his death was meaningless, the result of my uncontrolled temper and toxic pride. Sorry that his mother still grieved for him, while the person responsible sat beside her in bed each night. But apologies to the dead are useless. They don't change anything, don't undo anything, don't make anything better. They're just words spoken into darkness, as empty as the promises I had made to search for a son I knew would never be found. Now, at 73 years old, I find myself, at the end of my life, looking back on 30 years of lies, 30 years of being two different people, the devoted father everyone saw, and the murderer only I knew. 30 years of destroying my wife's life, bit by bit, day by day, with a lie she never questioned. Karen is 71 now. She deserves to know the truth, deserves to know what happened to her son, to finally have answers after 3 decades of uncertainty, deserves to know that the man she trusted, the man she leaned on through her grief, was actually the one who caused it all. Emily deserves the truth too, deserves to know where her brother is, to finally be able to grieve properly, instead of living in endless ambiguity, deserves to know that the father she supported through his loss was actually the one responsible for it. The community deserves the truth. They gave their time, their energy, their compassion to searching for a young man whose father had already buried him. They held vigils and organized searches and kept hope alive while the truth was hidden in plain sight. And Daniel deserves the truth to be told, deserves to have his death acknowledged, his grave found, his remains properly buried, with his name on a headstone, deserves to have people know he didn't run away, or start a new life, or meet some random tragedy. He was murdered by his father in a moment of uncontrolled rage, and his death has been covered up for 3 decades. But telling the truth means destroying Karen, means revealing that her decades of searching were pointless, that her hope was misplaced, that the husband she trusted was actually a killer. It means breaking her heart all over again, this time with betrayal added to grief. It means destroying Emily's family, means her children learning their grandfather is a murderer, means her life being defined by this revelation, this horrible truth that changes everything she thought she knew about her family. It means going to prison at 73 years old, probably dying there, means being remembered not as a devoted father, but as a monster who killed his own son and lied about it for 30 years. I don't know if I can do it, don't know if I'm brave enough, strong enough, decent enough to finally tell the truth, but I also don't know if I can continue living this lie, carrying this weight, being this person for whatever time I have left. The question haunts me, is truth worth the destruction it will cause? After 30 years, does honesty serve any purpose other than my own need for confession? Or would it be more merciful to let the lie continue, to let Karen die, still believing her son might somehow still be alive, to spare Emily the agony of learning her father is a murderer? I don't know the answer, but I'm running out of time to decide. The decision came to me on what would have been Daniel's 55th birthday. Karen had made her usual pilgrimage to the shrine she maintained in his old bedroom, lighting candles and sitting in his desk chair for hours, lost in memories of the son who would be middle-aged now if I hadn't killed him. I stood in the doorway watching her, and something inside me finally broke completely. 30 years was too long. 30 years of lying, of watching Karen torture herself with hope and uncertainty, of letting Emily live in the shadow of a brother whose fate I knew but never revealed. 30 years of being called a devoted father when I was actually a murderer. It had to end, but I knew I couldn't just confess verbally. After 30 years, they would need proof. They would need to find Daniel's body, and that meant I would have to lead them to the grave I had hidden so carefully 3 decades ago. The thought of returning to that spot in the forest filled me with dread. I hadn't been near it in years, couldn't bear to be close to where I had buried my son. But if I was going to confess, I needed to be certain the body was still there, still findable. I needed to prepare myself for what would happen when the truth finally came out. On a cold morning in late November, I drove the old logging road into the forest alone. It had been maintained over the years by the Forestry Service, so the route was still accessible. About 2 miles in, I parked and continued on foot, using landmarks I had memorized 30 years ago to guide me to the spot. The forest had changed. Trees had grown, fallen, been replaced by new growth. The landscape wasn't quite as I remembered it. For several terrifying minutes, I thought I had lost the location, that Daniel's grave would remain hidden forever, simply because I couldn't find it again. But then I saw it, the large boulder I had used as a marker, now covered in moss, but still distinctive, and beneath it, the slight depression in the ground that marked where I had dug 30 years ago. I stood there for a long time, staring at that spot. My son was beneath my feet, the boy I had raised, the young man I had failed, the person whose life I had ended in a moment of rage. He was right there, reduced to bones and decay, forgotten by everyone except the father who had killed him. I broke down completely. 30 years of suppressed emotion came pouring out in great heaving sobs. I fell to my knees beside the grave and wept for Daniel, for Karen, for Emily, for the 30 years of lies, for the life my son should have had. I wept for the father I should have been, and the monster I had become. When I finally composed myself enough to drive home, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let another day pass with this lie. Couldn't let Karen spend one more birthday lighting candles for a son who I knew would never come home. Couldn't let Emily wonder anymore what happened to her brother. The truth had to come out, regardless of the consequences. I started by writing everything down, every detail of that night in March 1995. The argument, the rage, the hammer, the burial, the 30 years of deception that followed, the search parties I had helped organize, while knowing they would never find anything, the comfort I had offered Karen, while knowing I was the cause of her pain, every lie, every deception, every moment of false hope I had allowed to flourish. The document was 42 pages long when I finished. It took me 5 days to write, 5 days of reliving every terrible moment, of forcing myself to acknowledge the full scope of what I had done. Reading it back, I was struck by how calculated my cover-up had been. This wasn't just a crime of passion, followed by panic. It took me 5 days to write. It was murder, followed by 3 decades of deliberate, methodical deception. But before I could bring this confession to the police, I needed to tell Karen. She deserved to hear it from me first, deserved the chance to react privately, before it became public knowledge. I owed her that much, though I owed her far more than I could ever repay. I chose a quiet evening, when Emily wasn't visiting, when it would be just the two of us. I asked Karen to sit down, told her I needed to tell her something important. She looked worried immediately, probably thinking I had received some new information about Daniel, some fresh lead, or terrible confirmation. I started by telling her that I knew what happened to Daniel. Her face lit up with hope, with the desperate belief that maybe, finally, after 30 years, we had found him. But I quickly extinguished that hope. I explained that I had always known what happened to him, that I had known from the very beginning, that the answer to her 30 years of searching was sitting across from her. The realization came slowly. I watched confusion give way to understanding, understanding give way to horror, horror give way to a kind of anguished denial. She kept shaking her head, kept saying no, kept refusing to believe what I was telling her. But I continued, explained everything. The argument in the garage, the hammer, the burial in the forest, the decades of lies. When I finished, Karen just stared at me. The woman I had been married to for 48 years looked at me as if I were a stranger, as if the man she thought she knew had never existed. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just stared, her face a mask of betrayal, so profound it was almost unreadable. Then she stood up, walked to the phone, and called the police. She said it simply, without emotion, as if reporting a stranger's crime. Her husband had just confessed to murdering their son 30 years ago. She gave them our address and hung up. Woodrelly head, Inti Olbert Arnden. Then she walked to the bedroom, closed the door, and locked it. I heard the sound of breaking glass, a photo frame, probably, and then nothing, just silence. I sat in the living room and waited for the police. 20 minutes later, they arrived. I invited them in, offered them the written confession, and told them where to find Daniel's body. They read the confession with expressions that cycled through disbelief, shock, and grim professionalism. Then they arrested me, read me my rights, and took me into custody. The investigation that followed was thorough and swift. They sent forensic teams into the forest with my directions. Within 48 hours, they had found Daniel's remains. 30 years underground had reduced him to bones and fragments of clothing, but dental records confirmed his identity. My son had been found at last, exactly where I said he would be. The media attention was massive. The devoted father, who had searched for his missing son for 30 years, had actually been the killer all along. It was the kind of story that captivates and horrifies in equal measure. Reporters camped outside our house. My face was all over the news. The community that had supported us for 3 decades felt betrayed, angry, shocked. Karen refused to see me or speak to me. I tried calling her from jail, tried writing letters, but she returned them all unopened. Emily came back immediately, devastated and furious. She stood outside the jail screaming at me through the glass, demanding to know how I could have done this, how I could have let them search for someone I knew was dead, how I could have been so monstrous. I had no good answers. There were no good answers. I had done something unforgivable, and then compounded it with 30 years of lies. No explanation could make that acceptable or understandable. My lawyer, court-appointed, since I had no money for a private attorney, advised me to plead guilty. There was no defense for what I had done. The confession was detailed and accurate. The body had been found exactly where I said it would be. A trial would be pointless and traumatic for everyone involved. A guilty plea would at least spare the family the ordeal of testimony and cross-examination. I agreed immediately. I wanted to plead guilty, wanted to accept full responsibility, wanted to face consequences for what I had done. The plea hearing was brief. The judge asked if I understood the charges: first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. I confirmed that I did. She asked if anyone had coerced my confession. I assured her no one had, that this was entirely my decision. She asked if I was pleading guilty, because I was in fact guilty. I looked directly at Karen and Emily, sitting in the front row with expressions of devastated rage, and said yes, I murdered my son Daniel Mitchell, and spent 30 years covering it up. The sentencing hearing was more complex. The prosecution wanted the maximum sentence, life in prison, without possibility of parole. They argued that not only had I killed my son, but I had spent 3 decades deceiving everyone, allowing a family to suffer needlessly, preventing proper burial and closure. The crime was made infinitely worse by the 30 years of lies that followed it. My lawyer tried to argue mitigating factors: my age, my clean record prior to this crime, my voluntary confession, but these arguments felt hollow even to me. The confession hadn't been voluntary in any meaningful sense. It had come only after 30 years, only after the guilt became unbearable. That wasn't courage or remorse. It was just finally breaking under the weight of carrying an unbearable secret. The judge allowed victim impact statements. Emily stood up and spoke for 20 minutes about what my actions had done to her family, about her mother's 30 years of anguish, her own lifetime of wondering what happened to her brother, the children who grew up never knowing their uncle. She spoke about the betrayal, about trusting me and supporting me while I was lying the entire time. She spoke about the Daniel she remembered, bright, kind, full of potential, and the waste of his murder at age 25. Karen didn't speak. She sat in the courtroom, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Hatred, certainly. Betrayal, obviously, but also something else. Grief, perhaps. Not just grief for Daniel, but grief for the man she thought she had married, for the 48 years of a marriage that had been fundamentally based on a lie for the last 30 of them. The judge sentenced me to life in prison without possibility of parole. She said that what I had done was among the worst crimes she had encountered, not just murder, but the systematic destruction of a family through decades of deception. She said that my confession, while necessary, came too late to constitute meaningful remorse. She said that I would spend the rest of my life in prison, and that was less than I deserved. I accepted the sentence without complaint. It was fair. It was just. It was less than what Daniel had lost, less than what Karen and Emily had suffered, but it was something. Prison at 73 is difficult. I'm too old for the general population politics, too slow for the violence that occasionally erupts, too tired to care about the social dynamics. I spend my days in a cell, reading, thinking, remembering. Other inmates know what I did. Murderer of my own son, hider of the body, for 30 years. Even in prison, there's a hierarchy of crimes, and what I did places me near the bottom. I don't complain. I don't seek sympathy. I accept every hardship as part of the punishment I deserve. I'm 73 years old in a place designed for younger men, and every difficult day is a small payment on a debt I can never fully repay. Karen filed for divorce immediately after my sentencing. After 48 years of marriage, she wanted no legal connection to the man who had destroyed her family. I signed the papers without contest, without asking for anything. She deserved to be free of me, deserved to build whatever life she could in whatever time she had left. Emily has visited me exactly once since my incarceration. She came to tell me that Daniel had finally been buried properly, with a headstone bearing his real dates, 1970 to 1995. She said the funeral was small, just close family, and a few old friends. She said Karen had cried throughout the entire service, finally able to mourn properly after 30 years of uncertainty. Emily also told me she never wanted to see me again, that as far as she was concerned, her father had died the same night Daniel did. The man in prison was a stranger, a monster wearing her father's face. She was telling her children that their grandfather was dead, because in every way that mattered, he was. I accepted this. I deserved no less. I had destroyed her family, stolen her brother, lied to her for 30 years. She owed me nothing, and I was grateful she had come even once to update me about Daniel's burial. I think about Daniel every day, in prison. I think about the young man he was, the writer he wanted to become, the life he should have had. I think about the moment I lost control, the hammer in my hand, the terrible finality of what I did. I think about the 30 years I could have spent grieving honestly instead of covering up, the 30 years Karen and Emily could have spent healing instead of searching. Most of all, I think about the father I should have been, patient, supportive, proud of my son, even when his choices differed from mine. If I had been that father, Daniel would be 55 years old now. He might have published that novel. He might have had a family of his own. He might have lived a full, rich life doing what he loved. Instead, he's been dead for 30 years, buried twice, once in a hidden grave in the forest, once in a proper cemetery with a headstone. And I'm responsible for both burials, for his death, and for the decades of deception that followed it. I don't expect forgiveness, not from Karen, not from Emily, not from the memory of Daniel, not from whatever higher power might exist. What I did is unforgivable, and I accept that. I don't seek redemption, because I don't deserve it. I'm simply finishing out my days in the place where I belong, paying a fraction of the debt I owe. This is my confession. I murdered my 25-year-old son in a moment of rage. I buried his body in the forest and spent 30 years pretending to search for him while knowing exactly where he was. I watched my wife suffer through 3 decades of uncertainty while I was the cause of her pain. I let my daughter grow up wondering what happened to her brother while I held the answer the entire time. I confessed, not because I wanted forgiveness or redemption, but because 30 years was too long to carry the lie, because Karen deserved to know what happened to her son, because Emily deserved to finally be able to mourn her brother properly, because Daniel deserved to have his death acknowledged and his remains properly buried. The truth didn't make anything better. Karen is still devastated, now dealing with betrayal on top of grief. Emily has lost both her brother and her father. The community feels deceived and betrayed. Confession brought no healing, no closure, no peace, but it brought truth, and after 30 years of lies, truth mattered, even if it couldn't undo any of the damage I had caused. My name is Robert Mitchell. I am 73 years old. I murdered my son Daniel and hid his body for 30 years. I will die in prison, hated and unforgiven, and that is exactly what I deserve. Daniel Mitchell was born in 1970. He loved reading and writing. He wanted to be an author. He was kind, sensitive, creative. He died at 25 because his father couldn't control his rage and couldn't accept that his son's dreams were different from his own. He deserved so much better than what I gave him, so much better than the life I allowed him to have, so much better than the death I caused, and the decades of deception that followed. This is my final statement, my complete confession, my acknowledgement of the worst crime I can imagine, killing my own child, and lying about it for 30 years. There is no forgiveness for this. There is no redemption. There is only truth, spoken too late to matter to anyone, except as a final accounting of what I destroyed. Daniel, if any part of you still exists anywhere, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You deserved a father who loved you enough to accept you as you were. Instead, you got me. And that was your tragedy, your waste, your undeserved end. I can't undo what I did. I can only acknowledge it, accept punishment for it, and spend whatever time I have left remembering the son I should have cherished, but instead destroyed. If this confession affected you, please subscribe to this channel for more untold stories from the elderly who can no longer carry their secrets in silence. Every week, I share real confessions about guilt, betrayal, murder, and the terrible prices we pay for our worst choices. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a story. These confessions remind us that some truths, no matter how devastating, must be spoken. One final question. After 30 years of searching and suffering, was Robert right to finally confess, or should he have taken the secret to his grave? Share your honest thoughts in the comments.